All right, good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. On behalf of the Capital District Special Education Task Force, welcome to Special Education Legal Updates 2023. Backed by popular demand, we have Tara Moffett here from Gervin Ferlazzo. And so I will, without further ado, turn things over to her.
Hello, welcome. So I will be covering everything in the kitchen sink about special ed with the updates for the year, a couple of hot button issues, and a number of different things. I know Alyssa usually does the video link, and I don't know if we need to do the Special Education Task Force introductory, but I will give you a brief overview of it from my own perspective, which is I've been involved in the Special Education Task Force for a number of years. Currently, I am the co-president of the Capital Region Task Force, and I'm on the governing council for the state. And basically, we came together as a think tank, realizing that in order to address issues, concerns, and make sure that we're providing the necessary supports and services to students with disabilities through our many different roles, we really needed to be in the same room and talking the same language. And so by offering trainings with a group of collaborative individuals, we can try to bridge some gaps and make sure that everyone is able to understand, access, and participate in both CSE meetings and also understanding the special education law, which is law for everyone. It's not different for districts or parents or advocates or agencies, it's the same. And we try to make sure that everyone understands that so we can move forward in a positive and collaborative way. So unless we need to run the video, Alyssa, I'm ready to jump right in and start the slide share. I did forward it, and Alyssa's going to forward the presentation out probably towards the middle or end of the presentation. For some reason, there's a lag in getting it to her, but it will get there. And in the meantime, join with me as I roll on through. Oh, I forgot my background. Sorry, my name is Tara Moffett. I'm a partner with Gervin and Ferlazzo and a longtime member of the Capital District Task Force, and I will be covering things from a legal perspective because this is what I do all day long, every day, represent like 70 districts and work with 4 different BOCES. So kind of have a lot of broad experience across a number of different worlds and environments. And I'm also involved in a number of different advocacy groups and organizations related to special education. So I try to stay on the forefront of what's going on in the world of special ed. So ideally, we will be able to give you a lot of information, and hopefully this will be helpful. Okay, so hopefully you are seeing my screen. Do we have a PowerPoint? I'm looking to see if everyone's nodding. Okay, great. So I'm going to make sure I do the start of the presentation, which is over here. Oh, come on, get rid of this taskbar. All right, moving that. Slideshow from beginning, and there we go. All right, now my technical glitches are done. So I am going to be covering special ed law, everything in the kitchen sink, including evolving and adapting to new guidance. And so everyone likes to have a little agenda of what we're going to cover. And for the record, I did get a number of questions that were provided in advance. So I have incorporated some of those into the presentation. And to the extent time permits, I will have some time at the end. But if you have questions, we'll feel free to post them and I will do my best to get through them. So my first thing I'm going to be covering is a perspective on special education, the challenges and shortfalls, and kind of what we're doing, both districts and the state, to sort of fill these challenges. I am then going to cover the new and updated state and federal resources, guidance, and implications, because there are many. And in particular, I've kind of pulled it out as its own subtopic, the review of discipline and students with disabilities. We've had a lot of changes in state and federal guidance. And if you were watching the news today, the governor signed a new law prohibiting corporal punishment, which isn't, I mean, we've prohibited it in New York for a long time, but now she's, signed a law that adds to it some additional measures. So we'll touch upon that briefly. And really what I would focus in on is the shift to proactive and restorative practices and alternatives to discipline, and what I consider responsive discipline instead of reactive discipline, which is a more disciplinary focus of, you've done this, now you pay the price, as opposed to you've done this, why? What can we do to fix that? What are our underlying causes, and how can we resolve those things? So it's a hefty agenda. I will do my best to speak at a normal rate. I can't make any guarantees, but I will do my best. So for me, the 23-24 perspective of what's happening now, well, I kind of boiled it down to what I call the top 5 issues. So the first one, and probably the biggest one that has been on everyone's minds and hearts, is that there are just no programs and placements. Districts are already at or close to capacity within their own programs. And for students with intensive needs, whether it's preschool through to exiting age students, we are running into a shortfall of programs that have the necessary supports and services, the therapeutic levels, as well as the other staffing and physical space resources necessary to meet the needs of some of our more challenging students. And it's not just, a question of would the districts like to create a new program. It's they literally can't staff, or they don't have space, or they don't have the resources, background, or training to be able to create new programs. The absence of these programs has really created long wait lists where kids are, either continuing in programs where we've already determined, hey, we're making a referral, hence we've agreed that this one doesn't work. And we have kids still staying in those programs longer with, sadly reducing and decreasing success. Or they are on reduced days or a graduated day, which may, depend upon how a student is responding on a given day. We've got some students who are on home tutoring, or even we've had some parents who have elected to pull their kids to homeschooling. And we've also had an increase of children who are in the gap time in hospitals. And many of them are stuck in hospitals or not even being admitted, but are hanging out in waiting rooms because they're saying they don't need to be here, but we are running into issues with families saying, I can't manage them at home. We don't have the resources. At least when they're there, I know they've got the care and support that they need. And it's becoming, a very challenging task. So just so that it's not all gloom and doom, I do have some hope on the horizon. So bear with me. So the second is the staffing and provider shortages. And again, this goes back to a lot of people are saying, well, why can't you just create a new program? Well, to create a new program, you need to have staffing. You need to have both the teaching staff, the instructional support staff, as well as the related service providers. Unfortunately, we're not seeing large numbers of people coming into the field. What we're seeing is people borrowing or stealing staff from one program coming over to another. So we're not getting a net addition. We're just basically shuffling our current resources around. As everyone is also painfully aware, transportation is one of the most challenging circumstances we're all facing right now. We don't have sufficient numbers of qualified drivers. Finding aides is becoming harder and harder, particularly where, non-education related jobs are paying better and including, benefits and other supports that maybe we don't have. And we are also looking at, because you don't have enough drivers, you don't have the ability to pick up or extend more routes or shorten the time on routes. So we have children who are either riding in longer buses or who are being sent on transportation with contract providers, which adds an additional layer of challenge because they're not, district employees. So we don't have the same level of ability to ensure compliance and oversight. We contract with them and we can include those provisions, but I've, personally experienced some challenges and pushback from different contract agencies saying, well, we don't have to do that. And I'm like, if you're going to transport our kids, you are. And so we kind of dance around that piece. And then, we've also had a high degree of staff and provider turnover, and that is contributing every day to the challenge where, the more consistent our staffing is, the better it is for our kids. They benefit, they have the familiarity, but with turnover, whether it's because people have health, family, personal issues, or what have you, each time there's a staffing change, we know that that has an adverse impact on our kids. And that can be very difficult for students who struggle with transitions, students who have difficulty navigating and dealing with and adjusting to new people. And especially if we don't have anticipated or prior knowledge, like someone has an accident or a medical issue, that can be, just enough to tip the scales against our favor. So I've also noted one of our other challenges is expanding mandates. We have the same resources or even decreasing resources and funding, but basically our numbers are the same, our staff, our dollars, what's coming in, but the obligation to do more with less continues to grow. And this is from everything from preschool on up, early intervention through to school age, and we'll touch upon the new extended eligibility to 22. We're in the final year of COVID-19 extended eligibility, which was at least legislative. We've also got a growing compensatory education backlog. And again, with the shortage of providers, our ability to meet our ongoing services as well as our future services, as well as makeup services, is becoming kind of I don't want to say a laughable challenge because it's not funny, but it's sort of like, I just don't know how we're going to make this blanket cover every square inch of what we need, but we keep trying. So we just sort of pull and hope that somebody gets what they need. Typically, our community agencies are OPWDD, which is Office of Persons with Developmental Disabilities, or Office of Mental Health, our Office of Children and Family Services, or Departments of Social Services, that's OCFS or DSS, probation, and the courts have been, our partners through some of these supports and services, particularly with providing that kind of wraparound support we need for our families who may have, kids who have needs both at school and at home. And they are both either over-enrolled or understaffed, and also facing some of the same shortages, funding, staffing, et cetera. So we have fewer resources available through those agencies and more people than ever accessing it because there's delays in access to healthcare, there's delays in access to treatment. So, our key supports that help maintain students at home and in the community are also being negatively impacted. The second factor is all of those agencies are mostly voluntary. So while, districts are getting a lot of pressure to address these supports and services for students that may go beyond a school day, if parents or agencies are not, keeping the cases open, or the families are failing. And sometimes the family's inability to comply is, really due to their own circumstances. They, the parents have mental health issues, they have compliance issues. But when those cases are closed and those services disappear, that is another, critical support, and you're taking out a leg from under the stool that supports our kids. And so that doesn't particularly help. And then last but certainly not least, and I mentioned it already, but I'll mention it again, compensatory services and our obligations continue to rise, but being able to find and secure the staffing to both provide our ongoing needs as well as our, makeup and supplemental needs to kind of resolve our missed or past due services just keeps going. And we used to rely upon retirees. We had, our substitutes. We had a lot of private and outside agencies that we could at least contract with when schools or, approved programs were maxed out. But we have such high demand that they get to pick and choose who and when and under what circumstances they're working. I'm not suggesting that there's anything wrong with that, but it's become very difficult. And candidly, the kids who probably need these services the most are the ones that are least likely to get them, because there's often a lot of challenge or an enhanced staffing component that's required. So those are kind of the most common issues. So now I'm going to break it down into a little bit more specific. So preschool and the transition from early intervention to preschool, one of our biggest challenges year to date and last year and the year prior has really been completing timely evaluations. Districts have to complete those evaluations within 60 calendar days of the date of receipt of consent. And I want to clarify that's the receipt of consent, not the letter of referral, because sometimes there's a misunderstanding as to when the clock starts. I know that some advocates and agencies will say to parents, well, write in your letter that you're granting consent for the necessary evals. But again, consent for purposes of special education needs to be informed consent. And the district has the obligation to notify the parents in writing of the nature and types of evaluations to be administered and the purpose for which that information will be used. So sending a letter saying I consent to evals doesn't cover the notice and the obligation. Plus, the district has to send you a copy of the notice of procedural safeguards. So that all comes with that that referral, consent, and other forms. So you can't really truncate it, but districts should be turning those consent forms and evaluation information around relatively quickly. We do have some solutions that are there, but right now we can say, admittedly, county lists and existing providers aren't meeting the need to just even complete evals. There's long wait lists and they're struggling within their own networks. So the purple highlights are things that we have been doing or what's moving in the right direction, but it doesn't necessarily resolve these issues altogether. So many districts are becoming approved preschool evaluators. NYSED deemed that school districts are automatically an eligible evaluator. So districts have gotten approval to do that, but that doesn't mean they still don't have to get county approval, which is not a huge burden, but it does require additional steps. A district evaluator is authorized and empowered to evaluate the student, but candidly, once the evaluation is done and we hold the CSE or CPSE meeting to determine eligibility, oftentimes districts have to tap out because they're already at capacity with, evaluations and supports and delivery of services for our school age students. And so if it's a matter of filling in related services, we may not have the bandwidth, so to speak, to pick those up. So the timely evaluation does not resolve the service delivery issue. There is some flexibility where parents and districts can agree to extend a timeline, but frankly, with the CPSE, that's not really a feasible thing. We extend timelines in school age, circumstances sometimes because we're doing RTI and we want to get more data and be more informed. With preschool, it's really designed to be a very prompt classification, evaluation, and initiation of services. So with the exception of if you need to defer because the student just can't get through the testing or evaluation and you need more time, you usually aren't getting a lot of adjournments or extensions on that timeline. From eligibility, we can get those done and we make those determinations once we have the magical evals in hand, but we're still running into an issue with securing the actual placement and services. Once we've identified them and evaluate them, we develop an IEP and we recommend programs and services. Typically, that would then be compared to your county provider list and say, okay, we have these 3 programs and 2 of them have openings. And so let's pick which one you want to go to or which one's closest to your catchment area and, assign the student and let's go. Well, that doesn't happen because we just don't have very many openings, or the openings that are available may be further from home or further away from where the parent and family or others are comfortable with sending the students. But when we are in a absence of options, we have to make sure that our obligation from a district perspective is to offer a FAPE, and the county is ready, willing, and able to pay. But if we can't get the parent to agree to put the student in that program, then we have a program and eligibility but no delivery, which doesn't help our students. I know parents struggle with having kids go further away, or they are anxious about center-based programs at times because they feel, well, they don't, if they did a regular or an integrated preschool, couldn't they just get the services and supports? The reality is sometimes not really. The center-based programs have the benefit of having the staff on hand, meaning they actually may have their own related service providers that are there that are incorporated into those programming. And whereas when we've got students who may be served at multiple non-approved programs, you may have them in your local daycare or a non-CPSE or a CSE approved program. That doesn't necessarily mean we're going to have providers available to go out to all of those spaces or even to homes. And so having them in a more central location does help with perhaps meeting more needs. Again, we still have to individualize, you still have to deliver, and if it's one-to-one, it doesn't matter whether it's center-based or other, but it's just a matter of access to the critical provider that we've been seeing some improvement with the center-based programs, but even they are maxed out and struggling. I've also noticed that when programs do accept students, it's exception with like 3 asterisks. So you're accepted, but we need a couple more weeks to find a provider and everything. So it's more of like, I call it the illusory acceptance. You're accepted in theory, but not in practice. And again, I understand we are all dealing with the same staffing shortages and challenges, but it doesn't, resolve the issue of we've made an eligibility determination, we've made a recommendation, and you have 60 school days to implement those services, and that ability to do that is contingent upon finding a program and providers to deliver those services. So the purple is, what are we doing? Well, districts have become UPK providers in a lot of circumstances, but we are still struggling with meeting the needs of our higher needs students because, even if a district is creating a UPK program, they may not have, space or staffing or, the number of staff or the expertise within that to be able to serve some of our high needs students. So we may be, taking a few of the students who are maybe in need of related services or other lesser supports, but who may not be able to meet the needs of the students collectively because our high needs placements are over enrolled and waitlisted, and kids are either sitting at home waiting, or we're stopgapping by putting together what services you can with the understanding that basically you're getting a big old IOU because we still owe those services even if we can't deliver them. And I will say that the state has committed and has followed through on expediting applications and approval, but it is still not a super easy process, and it does require both time and commitment to get through it. If you already have an existing program, it's easier to get an extension and a modification to add. But if you are starting fresh, it is a new experience and challenge, but there are, guidance on the state website to help people get through that. So even with the programs and placements that we have found, they are also struggling with staff shortages for kids who are in those programs. And some of it is we have them accepted and then, they believe they had all the staff they need and then we don't have an aide, or we don't have a speech therapist goes out on leave. And so now we don't have all of the supports and services that we need. So what they do is they say, okay, instead of giving, half the kids 100% of their services and the other half none, we're going to split the baby. And so you get, 2 out of your 3 per week, and you get your 1 out of your 2 per week. So everyone gets a little, but nobody's getting a FAPE. And the challenge we've had with that is we're often not, being informed, either parents or programs or districts aren't necessarily informed until after the fact. And sometimes it's because we didn't realize it was going to get that big. Like it was just, well, we just expected they'd be out a week. Oh, wait, no, now they're going to be out 2 weeks. Oh, wait, no, now they're having surgery and they're out for a month. And that, continues to build this gap, which is a big challenge. The second is, again, still having that shortage. Once we get back to staffing, you don't have the ability to backfill those missed services because you're so busy trying to catch up on the catch up of what you have. We're not even touching the comp ed that may be sitting around from that period of time between when they were eligible, but before services started for those preschool students. We're just trying to fill in the missed services while they were in the program, but missed those services to get them caught up. And then last, but certainly not least, and this really comes to the biggest topic of the day, is that, our preschool students are still facing informal suspension and removal without appropriate meetings, without due process and everything. And candidly, USDOE and the state education department have confirmed that discipline and failure to provide due process procedures is a big issue. And frankly, they are applicable to preschoolers. So that means manifestation determinations and proper 3214 type process should be applying to those preschool removals, even though it's not necessarily within the context of the law, but they're basically saying that there's a right to due process. And that means if there are both the informal removals or the formal suspensions and expulsions, there is a due process component that needs to be factored into it. So that is kind of a bigger thing, but it is shocking to consider the number and the percentage of preschool students with disabilities that are either suspended or expelled, which is grotesquely disproportionate to non-disabled students, in the same way that our regular students with disabilities are also exponentially more impacted by disciplinary removals and suspensions, which we will cover in greater detail as we go forward. So if the preschool people are appropriately depressed now, I'm moving on. All right, into our school age challenges. So we have a lot of the same things that they're dealing with as preschool. Lack of programs, staffing and providers, are impacting timely placements. If we have openings, it's still a matter of finding the fit, finding the time, coordinating transportation. And then we also have that growing comp ed, which I think at some point will topple over on us because we have so many kids in need of services for both compensatory and for missed services. And we're just, continuing to grow. It doesn't mean that people are not aware. It doesn't mean that districts and programs are not attempting to address this. It's just a continued issue because we need more bodies and we need more expertise. The districts and state are working together to try to collaborate and problem solve. We're working with teacher prep programs. We're working with related service provider programs. The USDOE is, sponsoring different orientation and mobility trainings and programs. We're all trying to figure out how to bring more in because the stealing from one another is not getting anything done other than just, moving a resource from one program to another. We're not getting a net gain. Why are some of school age challenges such a challenge? I just direct you to the link, which is the New York State law, regulations, and policies that are not required by federal law and regulation. You'll see it's a very nice, I think it's like a 35, 40 page document that shows here's what the federal law says and here's what New York does, because we're Sinatra and we do it our way and we do more. And we have a lot of individual entitlement, which is wonderful on the benefit of the students, but challenging in terms of both compliance and additional obligations. And so we, do have a lot more oversight, but also a lot more obligation to meet. And in particular, at the school age level, we do a lot of things differently that go beyond the federal requirements. And again, to the betterment of students often, but it doesn't come without, additional administrative time, additional staff time, additional meetings and additional requirements, and then also clearly additional staff. So another interesting development / challenge is, the good news is the diploma and graduation options are really continuing to expand and develop, recognizing that, not every student is the brick and mortar student. And so we've got more options. We've got, other components. You've got your alternative pathways, you have your compensatory and your safety net and your compensatory safety net special programs for students with disabilities. We have the superintendent's determination. But with all of these advancing and developing programs, it requires both, constant update and mindfulness of districts to keep up to speed, and frankly, a lot of education for parents and students and providers, because this diploma and graduation options each impact our planning, projection, and development of IEPs for our students as we go forward. So I've included in the document the link to the new general education diploma requirements, which is the latest and greatest for the moment. But I also wanted to draw your attention to, we've had two different groups. We've had the commission working on additional graduation measures, requirements, and developing, what we need to do to make sure our students are coming out highly educated, competitive in the appropriate levels for their individual needs. But they also just had the issuance of the state guidance on, they did an evaluation and assessment, and it just came out with the recommendations from the State Education Department Assessment and Review, which they're now looking at in conjunction with the commission on, the graduation development and programs, to then eventually they will come forward with some formal recommendations that will probably vary the two. But these are some big potential developments that are coming down the pike. They have not gone into effect yet, but keep in mind there will be new regs coming out, and when they do, there will be an opportunity for comment. And so if you have, interest vested or otherwise, or it's just part of, your children's future, you may want to be involved and be familiar with that. Certainly, one of the other great challenges we have is the unmet mental health and community support needs. And, again, we are trying as districts to find ways to bridge those gaps with both the lack of treatment as well as the lack of counseling and mental health services. So many districts where they have the capacity have partnered with clinical programs to offer mental health supports for students within the day, which eliminates some of the challenges of transportation and the ability of parents to maybe follow through if they're at multiple jobs and don't have the ability to take time off. It also provides districts with a mental health crisis support within the building in some cases. It can help bridge the gap for some instances. We've also, from our state, have really been working on trying to help make sure families and students remain connected with children's eligible medical services. And there's, additional information and resources on the State Education Department website, encouraging parents and families to make sure that their children remain eligible and continue enrollment. And also the commissioner issues guidance and newsletters at periodic intervals, at least monthly. And the September one also and the August both reference the importance of making sure that medical coverage continues, because it's essential to making sure that our kids are healthy and able to attend and benefit from school. One of the greatest challenges, as I said, is our interagency collaboration and cooperation. And, candidly, what our goal is to stop with the "it's your job" and everyone pointing fingers at someone else, and really coming back to, this is a problem that is global and we have to work together. Every agency should be saying, what do we need to contribute to the puzzle piece to fill the picture for our kids? And, having one agency, pointing to the other saying, this is for you to do, not for us to do, is not particularly helpful. And having that showdown, particularly over parents and kids, is never a good situation. So I wanted to draw your attention to the Council on Children and Families. It's an interagency resolution unit, which is, really designed as a resource to families, to agencies, to districts for those multi-system children to help navigate some of those complex issues for those kids served by multiple agencies to ensure that they're getting the services and they're not being, foisted off from one program to another without recognizing that we may all have equal obligations and responsibilities to these students. And it really works better when we work together instead of, pushing or trying to put the responsibility on one another. I will also say that the importance of these agencies is also because this group reports back to the commissioners of all of these state agencies. And that keeps the awareness of the frequency and the nature of these challenges. And I've used this group a lot with kids who are trapped in hospitals, where we know that they're medically stable and should be coming out. I understand and empathize with the family saying, I've got other kids in the home and they're not safe and I can't maintain them. And we've got, other agencies where they may be approved for very extensive budgets, but they can't staff and they can't get the supports. And so we're just in this constant state of crisis, and hospitals are becoming respite because there aren't some of those other programs or agency options. And so by ensuring that some of these agencies are, getting this information through numbers and through real life examples, I'm hoping we will be able to continue to cut down or come up with new or better mechanisms to, partner together to meet these needs. For example, the OMH and OPWDD came together and created a kind of joint program for kids who have both mental health and developmental disabilities, and it's a 6 to 9 month program. It's of course way over enrolled and overfilled, but it was a good example of what can happen when the right people come together and say, we need to fix this problem and we need to figure out how to do this, because the people who are getting, stuck in the time frame here is our kids, and that can't happen. In terms of trying to support our children with complex needs, there's been a lot of developments, and I'm only going to give you the very briefest overview because I do want to make sure I have time to cover everything in the kitchen sink as we go on. But there have been updates to home, hospital, and homebound instruction. So home tutoring, I think we all have a general understanding of. It's typically when the student is unable to come to school due to a health or medical issue. They may be tutored at home, they may be virtually tutored, they may be tutored at school or in the community. Homebound is when the student is unable to, exit their home because of health or medical reasons. I think hospital is pretty self-explanatory. The other option is, children in facilities for care and treatment of kids. Those are usually going to be in conjunction with another agency, except for kids who may be in rehabilitation for substance abuse or who may be in rehabilitation for physical or post-surgical needs. But each of those are still situations under which kids, being kids, are still entitled to access education. So they've updated the regulations really to address the fact that we had a whole lot of kids who were getting home tutoring or homebound hospital or other instruction during COVID. And then, they realize that they're out sometimes for 3 months, 6 months or longer, and realizing that there aren't enough measures or supports or recognition that there may also be disability related issues and concerns that should come up. So they revamped these regulations and created a whole new 100.22 regulation, which really is designed to both address access to an appropriate education for any student who may or may not be a student with a disability, but then in particular to make sure that there's an access to FAPE, a free appropriate public education for SWD, students with disabilities who are unable to attend school due to health or medical issues. The key components of that is that there needs to be, the district has to create an application, and the parents can submit that application for home, hospital, homebound instruction. Hospital instruction, we're usually contacted by the hospital, but as a parent or an advocate, make sure that people are notifying the district, because it sometimes takes a day or two to get information over and make sure that they're getting the work so that the students can keep up. I know a lot of people are like, that's the least of my concerns, but it's still the most of your concerns, because we want kids to stay on top so that they can transition back successfully. We also, as part of the application or in conjunction with the application, parents need to submit a letter of medical verification and sign consent to allow the school's director of school health services to communicate with the provider regarding the request and the letter of support to make sure that they understand the nature. So they are ultimately, this is now going to be a medical determination whether those homebound instruction or home tutoring will be approved. Once the application is filed, the district has to begin providing tutoring as a transition until there is that determination by the school medical provider. And then within 5 days of getting that info, the school medical provider needs to render a written determination. And then if it's denied, the parents have 10 days to appeal. If they file the appeal, the home tutoring will continue and pending the review by the Board of Ed. This also provided for oversight and a regular written plan for periodic review, basically to make sure when they were doing home tutoring and what it constituted varied widely from district to district and region to region. So not only do they require a written plan to make sure kids are, accessing education and are meeting learning standards, but they've also changed the hospital homebound instruction to 2 hours daily for elementary and 3 hours daily as of July 1, 2023. I will give you the caveat, there's a little asterisk. Yes, there are some kids who, even under the best of circumstances, may not be able to withstand even that under certain circumstances when they're in a crisis. There is the ability for a medical provider to recommend less than the minimum number, but it has to be supported by written documentation. And that absolutely needs to be reviewed on a regular basis, because if we're doing less than the minimal number of hours, we should be reviewing that very frequently, because you only want to do that when it is absolutely necessary. And as soon as the student is able, you want to go back at least to the minimum number of hours of instruction. And again, always our goal when we go to home hospital or homebound instruction is hopefully to minimize the amount of time they're in that. Once they're available and ready to transition back, whether it's partially or full-time, that transition begins sooner rather than later. Then we hit the big ones: discipline, restraint, timeout, removal. The whole processes and procedures have been, let's just say, zhuzhed. We've gone and changed it, we've expanded it, we've clarified it, and we have a whole lot of guidance. And it really starts back in, 2022 and earlier, but in particular, 2022 was a big year because there was, if you remember from my presentation last year, they issued like 7 different guidance docs on the same day in July for 504 and OCR and, OSEP, Office of Special Ed Programs, on IDEA. And we talked about alternatives to discipline and, positive, proactive behavior and supports. All of that came out. And then in the following week of that, New York State, that's Chapter 516, went ahead and said, hey, we're now passing the provision that requires same-day notice to parents of the use of physical restraint and timeout. At the time, it was timeout with 2 words, but now it's 1 word. I'll explain later. And then we also had the guidance from the Secretary Cardona with the US DOE saying basically end corporal punishment. There are still like 17 states that allow versions of corporal punishment. Sad, but true. And there are many other where some of their preventive or responsive measures would, in my mind, fall under the guise of corporal punishment. And as you had, if you watched the news this morning, you heard that Governor Hochul also just signed a prohibition on corporal punishment. New York State and our state ed law and regs have prohibited that for quite some time, but this is kind of the regs have prohibited it, but now it's taking it to the next level, which is good. And then I wanted to draw your attention to the last link, which is positive supports for behavior and discipline. OSEP, the Office of Special Education Programs, has actually gathered a ton of good resources for behavior supports, discipline practices, all of those guidance memos I just referenced. They're all in one helpful place from the federal perspective. New York has some of those links, and also we have our own, and I have them all embedded in the program here. But these are some good links. If you're looking for how do I find this stuff and spend the least amount of time, go to this link. That's the magic. Okay. So in addition, we have the supplemental guidance from the state, which really kind of took what we had already begun in the fall in 2022 and said, okay, here's what we're doing. We're really moving and we're issuing formal guidance. We're updating our regulations, and we're going to make it very clear what we are doing for our students and what we are no longer doing and what is no longer permitted. I am going to break down the discipline and the restraint and seclusion a little bit further, but these are the links to the key documents. And then I wanted to draw your attention from hot off the presses just this month, although I think it lists September, but we only had it available, came in October, was they went back, and I had opined early on, don't get excited, because originally there was some initial feedback from the state saying that this that the minimum 2 and 3 hours of daily instruction didn't apply to students who were out on suspension. Guess what? It does. So they've issued a formal opinion of council, making it clear that yes, for all students now who would be on home hospital or disciplinary removal, the minimum number of hours are 2 hours a day elementary and 3 hours a day for secondary school students. And that just came out.
Sarah, we actually had a question in the chat about that.
Okay, fine.
That was whether those minimums also apply to students who aren't of compulsory school age.
No, because these relate to compulsory school age, but I don't know if because they extend the due process guidance to preschool. I will have to check on that. That's going to have to be a follow-up question. So TBD. I don't have an exact answer. I know the procedural rights extend. It would make sense, but we don't really have a minimum number of hours required for preschool age students. The amount of services you receive in that time frame really depends on the level of need of the student. And so some kids may get 1 hour of CIT, some may get 3 hours. So it really is more of an individual assessment. So my guess is that it would not apply, but I will still take a run at it and see if I can get clarification from the state. And I know there might have been a few state folks on the call, but I'm not going to put you on the spot. If you're comfortable, and no, feel free to weigh in. If not, stay silent. I will not call you out. Okay. So last but certainly not least, we know that there are delays in accessing services and our continued need for collaboration. And frankly, I think more than ever, we really need to understand each other's systems, navigating the delays in other systems, understanding what we as one system can do to help and facilitate another can be particularly powerful. Again, you know, the school is not an evaluation agency for OPWDD or OMH services, but if as part of our regularly scheduled evaluations, we are able to identify what information is relevant and helpful, and it helps us as a school district as well, those may be evaluations and information that we can help to make sure that they have those timely reports and evals that may help facilitate the application and eligibility process. I'm only going to touch upon this very briefly, the expanded age eligibility up to age 22 now. And again, it had to do with the 2001 Second Circuit case. In the end, it's really going to apply to a relatively finite number of students because these are going to be kids who have not met a high school graduation credential, a diploma, or a Regents diploma by their 22nd school year. It used to be that through 21, the school year in which you completed 21, you could remain or then exit with a skills and achievement credential if you did not qualify for one of the other supports. On the flip side, now this extends that potentially longer. The issues that come with it is that right now, law and approved funding streams don't provide any funding for this extended eligibility. And candidly, many of those students who might fall in that narrow group of the skills and achievement pursuing high school diploma or diploma credit options maybe are, you know, high cost. They could be residential students. They could be students who have, you know, intensive support needs and a lot of transition support needs. And I'm just concerned about a number of different problems. One is the funding. You know, once the IDEA and our state funding currently goes till 21. So our COVID legislation made it legislatively mandated. So we had to do it. And so therefore, and we were able to use some of the GEAR and the ESSER and other federal monies, but that money has come to the end or is coming to the end, and that legislative responsibility comes to the end. This is an opinion of council, but I would never say ignore opinions of council. However, I am concerned about, you know, the threefold challenge of one, if kids who were anticipated to exit are not exiting and are staying back another year, that's going to put another group of people into the challenge to pursue those same services next fall, with the people who are exiting as their regularly scheduled time, plus this new group, unless everybody delays by a year. Two, there were some students and providers, and we've been transition planning for these kids to exit at the end of their 21st year for many, many years, and we may have already been able to help set them up and gear them towards programs or adult services. Surrendering those options, if you have them now, does not guarantee that those options will be available in another, you know, 12 months. Or whenever. So just keep that in mind. And last, I really think that for me, the bigger concern is kids staying in programs longer that weren't anticipated creates a number of issues that we have not encountered. it expands the age range of kids who are in those high school programs, where you're going from 15 to 21 was a bit of a stretch, and now you're talking 15 to 22, almost 23 potentially. That's expanding that. How do you have similarity of needs? So there's a lot of things that require a need for advocation and legislation to advocacy and legislation to make sure that we're getting both the funding, the guidance, and the direction, because we need to make sure that there's a plan. And frankly, this all goes back to our same point of the interagency collaboration. We need to have both funding and continued services to make sure that kids are exiting school into the programs and services they need as adults, and that there's a better plan so that we're not in such a gap where parents are coming back saying, I want them to stay, not because I don't agree that they're ready to go, but because there's nowhere for them to go to. And that has become, a big challenge for a lot of folks. And it also, for me, my bigger concern is we've got kids staying in programs where that now means kids who would need to go to those programs are also being blocked out. It used to be called bed blocking, because when there was an adult in those programs that was still in a kid's bed, but they couldn't transition to adult services, now we're creating an eligible backlog that potentially is blocking even further. So that's, lots of stuff. All right. Everyone feeling energized? Yay! New guidance and information, USDOE and NYSED updates. So if you have not been keeping up on checking in on the state ed website or even the USDOE website, take a look. There's been a lot of developments. There's been a lot of updates to those sites. They both not only look new, jazzy, and are more accessible, but they also have some good information and resources. I wanted to draw your attention. This is not new from now, but from May of last year, but really, it's really started to come into its own. The OSE special education partnerships, where we're really, creating these trainings from these network regional teams to kind of offer training to parents, advocates, agencies, obviously school districts, administrators, and community partners. They're all free. Most of them are either in person or online. They're done by region. There's both the link to the partnership website itself, and then there's the link to, this is just a sample of some of the free trainings coming up in November and December. I just picked mostly North Country as well as the Capital Region ones, but there are more that span the scope of the state. And just to really give you a sense of, they're doing a lot of good trainings and information. It's going to cover some broad topics. Many of them may be at different levels. Some of them may be or advanced when they're expecting that it's going to be attended by district staff or providers. Others of them are more of a global overview. But some of them can be particularly helpful. They have a creating the IEP for preschool. They have a creating the IEP for school age. So those are some good ones if you're trying to figure out how to provide guidance or parent, education, training, resources. A lot of folks ask, where do I go? These are some additional resources that you can direct them to. The USDOE also got a big old guidance document that came out. Sorry. Believe it or not, I do sometimes take a breath or water. So over the summer, the USDOE issued a guidance about gently but yet firmly reminding states in a 45-page memo of their obligation to ensure compliance with IDEA and oversight, as well as reporting and implementation. And that spans the responsibility from EI, early intervention, all the way through to edge of school age programs. It identified based on, different civil rights data, and I've included some of the links to that information and where you can check your own district or regional data and look at different subcomponents. As to, the failings, there were, I think that they said that there were 7 that met all the criteria, 7 states that met all the criteria. There were a few more that met different criteria under different circumstances, but basically there wasn't enough people who were hitting all of the bells and whistles to really merit an exciting celebration of what we're looking to see. So it was disturbing. So they issued this very gentle 45-page reminder to make sure people are aware that you as the state are responsible. And I suspect that this will result in more state audits and compliance checks, as well as additional reporting, potentially even within your local and regional BOCES, to make sure that they're doing those sort of spot checks to make sure everyone is got compliance. And again, we all have the same compliance issues. we know where our challenges are: completing timely evals, securing services and initiation of those programs, addressing compensatory education makeup services, and our other challenges that arise on a case-by-case basis. But again, there's also some resources. The last link on the page is monitoring state improvement plans, and also the OSEP Ideas That Work website, which has a whole lot of different examples, resources, tools, and materials that can be helpful both for districts as well as for states. And then any of the other links that are on this page have links within these documents to other resources to help you. Why do we care about oversight? Because oversight means implementation, and everything about IDEA is about complying with implementation, because implementation equates to programs, delivery, services, and outcomes. So I also wanted to draw your attention, and if you're a geek like me, you're registered for all of the notices, the State Education Department, special ed notices, and the US DOE. But if not, I would encourage you to go and link on the US Department of Education to subscribe to different newsletters from the state or from the US DOE. And also you can subscribe to the newsletters from the State Education Department, and they send out monthly updates on new resources, links, information. I also, for those who haven't ever or familiar with it, we also have the New York State Center for School Health Services. And that is a wonderful resource. And if you and your school health team are not currently registered, please, please, please make sure that they do. They have so many resources, guides. They also have the ability for nurses and your school director of health, whether they're physician or otherwise, to communicate internally on their own listservs and chat amongst themselves and to seek guidance from the state. So I would encourage you to make sure people are aware of that and are using that. But again, these newsletters oftentimes have links to resources, to programs, to interesting articles, as well as to other guidance. So for example, there were
No, if we can do 2 days back to back,
Okay.
let's do it that way.
Oh,
That was one of my thinkings about.
I don't know who's
Yeah.
not muted.
Let's
but
do that.
Melissa, if
Knock
you could
everybody
see who it
out
is, that would be great.
Beautiful.
Or Tuesday, Wednesday.
Okay, hang on a second. Sorry about that. Somebody was off mute. So again, if you can go back and make sure that you take a look at them, there's recent guidance and newsletters, including, the reducing exclusionary discipline, and a lot of good blogs and resources there with a lot of the links that I've mentioned. But also they have other things like, the high power of expectations and inclusion, and other, things such as the preparation for O&M specialists, which is another area that we are desperately in need of. There's also free resources for stakeholders. Improving outcomes and results for children with disabilities. There's a nice guidance document, and there's a whole bunch of links and ideas that work. So again, I'm not going to go into each one of them, but I will just tell you, these are all good resources. You can spend days, weeks, months studying them all, but if you're looking for something, they're probably on this page, and it can get you to it to help you understand. All right, everyone, buckle your seatbelts. We're in for the ride. So new and updated guidance for discipline, restraint, and removal practices. What's new and what's changing? As I had already alluded to, the US DOE has really been coming in and clearly stating that the frequency of use of discipline is both disparate towards both students with disabilities, students with colors, students of color, students of different, racial backgrounds, ethnicities, gender identity and expression. And the disproportionality is out of sync with the number of students and the frequency and use of those disciplinary practices. So last summer, July 2022, they issued all of these things to really kind of cover most of the background, the guidance, what we do differently, what do we need to do, and to really review with people, understanding the steps from the rights of students, from discipline and removal and manifestation, and when and under what circumstances those things apply, as well as in the last one is the state discipline updated guidance, sort of the national equity landscape, which really is kind of a global view across all areas, saying this is what we're seeing in terms of exclusionary discipline. If you really we're looking for a tough read, go ahead and read that. But again, when you look at this and you think, why is this such an issue? I remind you, 17 states in the United States still allow corporal punishment, or at least as of the time of the reporting. Hopefully some of those have already changed, but you don't know. So these are the specific guidance documents that were issued in July 2022, right to the links. These are the most relevant ones. What's missing here are the Dear Colleague cover letters in most of those cases, or there were some additional like resources, but this is the majority of them, and you can just take a look at it. And at the end, we're really looking at, you know, the impact and why do we care? Because the more kids are removed from programs, the less they are to meet their goals, the less they are likely to finish out education, and the less likely they are to benefit from and to successfully transition. On that same line, as I said, Chapter 516, this one was in 2022, and it basically said that districts have to provide same-day notification to parents of the use of restraint, or at that time it was a space, timeout room, 2 words, of use of any students. And districts adapted and started those notices, and some had already been doing it, but we, you know, made sure everyone is doing it from that point forward. Fast forward to March 2023, USDOE says basically it's not enough to just address the discipline issue. We also need to talk about corporal punishment. We need to talk about, you know, inappropriate use of physical interventions, restraint, seclusion, and look at the research. It doesn't support, these things do not change the students' conduct or behavior. You know, behavior interventions, proper programming, staffing and training, those are the things that are research-based and validated. So they issued their guidance talking about these guiding principles to create safe, inclusive, and supportive environments, and also analysis that came out on the corporal punishment prevalence, which is startling, but, you know, again, it's basically every scary movie you saw when the teacher comes and, you know, grabs a ruler and smacks the kid in the hand, you know, or worse. So we just don't want to be in a world where, you know, people are using physical punishment for students in general, and in particular for students with disabilities who may not even be able to connect the cause and the effect. So obviously this is the right thing to do, but it does require, you know, both a shift in mindset and a shift in focus to really think about restorative and responsive practices and not reactive and removal. Removal moves the kid out of your sight, but doesn't resolve the underlying issue, nor why did they engage in those underlying behaviors. Restorative and responsive allows for the discussion and thinks about, you know, why did this happen? What could we do to figure it? What are the things that we can do? And also, are we following all of our procedural obligations, timing, our notice? Are we looking at, is this really the appropriate level of discipline to be imposed? Because there is discretion, and districts that have those, you know, zero-sum tolerance policies, you know, I understand the rationale, but at the same point in time, doing a 5-day suspension for a vape, you know, to me doesn't necessarily have the same level of impact, and it's basically removing a kid for 5 days. I understand, and I am, you know, horrified that children are dry cleaning their lungs with vapes. But at the same point in time, there has to be a better way to address that issue through, you know, programming, through supports, through, you know, after school detentions, as opposed to an out of school suspension. And so those are things that folks need to really be looking at. Districts also, because of the new changes in restraint, seclusion, and timeout, requires a bunch of changes to district policy, new provisions, new forms, new resources, and new requirements. So first, how are we responding, and what do we need to do to keep up with those changing? Basically, really looking at districts and, you know, the state coming together on building and district-wide approaches and changes. These are a number of resources from both the state education department as well as the U.S. Department of Education. I'm a big fan of the guidance from the Schott Foundation. I thought that had a lot of helpful steps and information on how to move from zero tolerance to a more restorative and responsive practice. You know, we obviously have been working on building our internal capacity for years with both our social emotional learning, as well as, you know, looking at different ways to support students' needs. The USDOE and federal departments of education both have tons of resources. The Educator Toolkit has resources that are listed both on our New York State Education Department website as well as the USDOE. So these are some of those sites that give you more bang for your buck. So just a sort of an example of the Schott Foundation, and this is why, and again, I'm not a Schott Foundation mentee or anything like that. I just thought that this was kind of a good way to break it down. This is from one of their resources, and it talks about a tale of to school, what the day would look like. Carlos is the young student, has a fight with his parents at home before he goes to school. He's running late. Here's two different ways that the world can look. One is the zero tolerance education system. So he's already had a problem. He fought with his parents. He's late to school. He's already grumpy. He maybe didn't get breakfast. Who knows? He comes into school on the left-hand side and he's greeted by metal detectors and police searches. He gets to his first period class late because he's already late and now he's grumpy. And then he had, to go through the detector and get his bag patted down, gets a period class late. The teacher scolds him. He, mouths back. He gets a detention. So we're already having a pretty rambunctiously awesome day. He then heads to the cafeteria, gets into a minor altercation in the cafeteria with someone who looked at him wrong or said something, or he just was having a tough time. The school police officer detains and then arrests the two students. Never good to have kids involved in the legal system if we can avoid that. And then Carlos goes to juvenile detention all afternoon. He misses school. Now he has a arrest record. He's also facing school-based suspension. And, the story goes on. With each increase in contact with juvenile justice, the likelihood of students having educational success and completing school starts to go down. So the zero tolerance system is not a good way to go. Let's talk about our restorative practices-based education system. So Carlos gets into the same fight with his parents, and he comes to school. Teachers and administration welcomes him. Welcome to school. Hey, they know he's late, but no one's going to point it out to him because he's there. And that's, right now we're working on focusing on getting him in. He gets to his class late. Teacher waits until after class and speaks with him to, find out what's going on. Also sets up a meeting with his counselor to address any issues and concerns. He then goes to the cafeteria. The same fight breaks out. Kids are still going to be kids. And instead of the police, there's student peer mediators and the support staff come forward. They have the students have a quick moment. They de-escalate. Everyone goes to class. Later that afternoon, they circle back. Carlos and the other student, agree to clean the cafeteria during a free period. So we've got some restorative responsive practice. Then he ends up meeting with a counselor, which the teacher had already set up for him when she talked to him after class. They chat with him and also the parents about helping resolve that conflict. So the next day, Carlos has a better day. So you can see the two clear differences between a restorative and responsive practice versus a reactive and removal-based practice. And again, everything is not going to be as black and white as this particular day, but I think you get a sense of, we need to think about discipline and removal. It's a whole new child-centered world. We got to rethink, retool, reframe, and really come at this from a different perspective. So New York State regulations, I'm going to dig into them a little bit further. What's changed is obviously we have a whole new things and expanded protections against corporal punishment and the use of aversive interventions, including seclusion and prone restraint. Seclusion is a great big old no-no. Prone restraint, meaning face down, is an absolute prohibition. So anyone who is using prone restraint, whether it was part of a training program, which most of them have, excluded, but if it was, or if you see it happening because people are doing it when they shouldn't be, we need to make sure that that is not happening. Why? Because prone restraints are more likely to cause injury or impact breathing or interfere with the student's ability to, communicate. Plus it's dangerous. And, we've seen enough on the news to know that a prone face down restraint is one of the most dangerous events and activities. So just make sure that that is not in your arsenal or repertoire at all. It also redefines the limited authorized use of physical restraint, timeout. It explains what is a physical escort that is permitted. And it really talks about making sure districts have a multi-tiered system of supports and de-escalation. It's not just enough to, respond to the crisis, but we're looking at, okay, we need to separate and now we need to do something, because you can't have two warring students at the edge of their, red zones ready to blow up. We need to bring them back down. So it's all about not just response, but also de-escalation and restorative practices. You may not use physical restraint in response to destruction of property. So if a student is tearing up the room, we are not going to restrain them unless that property damage would likely result in imminent harm to that student or others. So if they're picking up chairs and are about to throw them, yes, it could destroy the chair, but we're going to intervene because of the safety of others. But if they're just tearing down a billboard, which it breaks my heart because I know people put in a lot of time, or they may be destroying other students' work, but we're not going to physically intervene. We may use many other strategies and supports, but you cannot use physical restraint. There are some new obligations for documentation and reporting. We've already talked about the same-day notice, but now it is codified in our regulation. School administrators, this is new, and their designees have to have a debrief with the individuals who were involved in the use of a physical restraint or timeout after each incident in which it is used, or as soon as practicable thereafter. So if an incident happens at the end of the day, our staff is going to focus in on, helping the student, notifying the parent, getting the documentation together, and then they'll debrief after. If it happens early in the day, it'll probably happen within the course of that day. And that's really to do a review of a number of different steps and measures, which I lay out on the next page. The other part is there needs to be a regular review of documentation of that district's use of timeout or physical restraint, and follow up with staff if those restraints or timeout is being used regularly, to really review, are the resources appropriate? Is the training appropriate? Is this being used as a default in lieu of other appropriate supports? And then there is a requirement for a copy of the report for timeout or restraint to parents within 3 business days. That's a new one. We had to give the oral notice, and now they get a copy of those reports. That's part of the reg. So I said I broke down what else goes on in the debriefing. Well, you first, the same day notice to the parents, whether or not the intervention, physical restraint, or timeout, it should be timeout together, not 2 words. It's hard because I mentally think of timeout as 2 words, but the new definition puts it as 1. And, if that same day notice is also to give parents the option of meeting if they want to talk about that incident and to talk about what occurred. Then you need to have written documentation provided to those parents within 3 business days. And again, I go back to, people are like, well, we write on the reports information, and I'm like, there shouldn't be anything that goes on that report that isn't factual, that should be problematic. It should be identifying all of the pieces that go into the restraint, such as the circumstances leading to the use of timeout, what was happening, who was involved, what were the strategies used, what proactive interventions or strategies did they use prior to stepping forward with timeout or physical restraint. With the debriefing, there's also, as part of that administrative review, the planning for prevention and reduction of future need for timeout or restraint with a student. That may be, a referral to CSE and special ed if this is, a pattern starting to emerge that raises the question of a disability, or other services, building level or otherwise. For students with disabilities, it could be a BIP and an FBA. For students without disabilities, it could be a positive behavior intervention or a multi-tier support system services plan. And if they have an IEP or a 504 or a behavior plan, there may need to be a review to make sure that the supports and measures in place are effective and appropriate. After, there still needs to be a designated staff member who's going to debrief with the student to talk about the behavior and to, make sure that the student understands what happened, why, and, what we're looking for and how do we try to move forward. It's got to be consistent with their age and developmental ability. Sometimes the immediate review of an incident is actually going to escalate a student, so it's got to also be factored into what's appropriate for that particular student, but ignoring it and pretending it didn't happen is not usually the best practice. So the administration really needs to be regularly reviewing timeout and physical restraint documentation to ensure compliance. And if there are multiple incidents occurring in the same classroom or with the same staff, they need to look to determine, if they need to make any appropriate measures or steps. So, training, support, reviewing programming, reviewing staffing, looking at your resources. That's all part of the new additional layer of review. And again, the goal is to minimize the use of physical restraint or timeout because they should be a last resort, not a first resort. And, we also have some additional training obligations. So the training is annual training to all staff on schools' policies and procedures related to timeout and physical restraint. Okay, that also is not just about here's our policy and here's our documentation requirements, but also we're going to teach you evidence-based, positive, proactive strategies on crisis intervention. prevention procedures, de-escalation. And then in particular, for those who may be actually called upon, not just need to know about it, but those who would be called upon to implement, they must receive annual evidence-based training in safe and effective and developmentally appropriate timeout and physical restraint procedures. So is there a state mandated procedure or technique? No, that's where your district has to weigh in, and that's also part of your policies and practices, but there needs to be training, and there needs to be, you know, specific training for those who may actually be called upon. Every district needs to update or adopt, if you didn't have one, which you should have, but let's just pretend you need to update your written policy to include the new language, and also make sure that that is now available and posted on your website. Candidly, only a few districts already have this written policy done and updated and posted. Many of those are mine, yay, because I created one and sent it around very early on. But a lot of people are just, you know, picking up these pieces, and it's, you know, because you have to go through multiple reviews in order to update a policy. You know, they may be in the first or second reading, so there's still potentially some time to, you know, give feedback or to get additional information. But these new written policies have to include factors which may precipitate the use of timeout or physical restraint. In other words, when and why would we use it? And it should be very appropriately clear that those are only a last resort when every other appropriate measure, intervention, or pre-referral or de-escalation and proactive strategies and crisis intervention fails. So if you don't have a laundry list of things that are happening, it either had to have happened so quickly that there was no other way to make sure the safety of the student was addressed, or you have a laundry list of things that you tried and then ultimately, you know, got to that level where this was the only appropriate measure. You have to have developmentally appropriate time limitations for the use of timeout and physical restraint. Now, if you have an IEP with timeout, you need to have the specific time frame and the limited max amount of time that they could be in timeout on that document, but there also should be a district policy that may have specific, you know, developmentally appropriate time limitations, because being in another room away from instruction and away from peers, even if you're supervised, even if you're not locked, you know, it gets to a point where, you know, you're gone from timeout to seclusion, and we're not looking to, you know, promote seclusion. That's just isolating kids, and that's not particularly effective. It's, you know, actually ineffective, and it might actually contribute to, you know, creating an additional barrier or challenge. So it's also important to make clear that your timeout spaces and rooms cannot be locked. If they have a lock or a lock feature, it must not be engaged, and the student needs to be able to be continuously observed, supervised, heard. It's got to have either typical traditional lights, or it could have, you know, appropriate lighting if it's a sensory type room. But, you know, there's different spaces and different places. I would not have your sensory room also be your timeout room, because those are probably two different experiences. If you have a sensory room, students going to the sensory room isn't necessarily timeout. They're going to receive the support that they need. We still have to keep mindful of the amount of time they're out in order to use some of those resources, but that's different from a student being escalated. They go to timeout to get regroup and then hopefully transition back. Again, your policy must make clear that prone restraint is absolutely prohibited. It should reference the same-day notification for parents, as well as, you know, written report and a copy of that to parents within 3 business days. They've updated to 200.22 to eliminate both the individual specific aversive, you know, permissions. So basically now aversives are completely out, which is good. And most of us haven't done that, but there was still that provision in the Human Rights Committee where you could have certain permission to use some of the aversives in a limited way. Those are all gone. And basically, you know, we want to make sure that, you know, the behavior support plan is designed to teach and reinforce alternative options for appropriate behavior, that timeout itself is not really the outcome. It's a measure as a short-term crisis response while we work on trying to address the underlying behavior. Then we have the staff training, and then there's data collection and monitoring. And again, it's both monitoring by the building administrator, reviewing those frequency of use and data reports, as well as monitoring by the district in general across all of its buildings, and then monitoring and review by the reporting that is done to the state education department, which then has to report the monitoring to the US DOE. So everybody's looking over everyone else's shoulder, but we're still trying to work towards, you know, eliminating corporal punishment and eliminating improper use of restraint and seclusion as a, you know, consequence or as a punishment, because that is not what it is designed to do. It's a crisis stopgap measure. Only in the event that without this, there's a high risk of harm to that student or others. Once that risk is removed and others are removed from the location, the room is secure, the space is clear, you release. You do not hold them, you do not maintain them unnecessarily. And if it's not working, you need to be able to call it, because you don't want to have kids in a physical hold for extended periods of time, because the longer you hold them, the more likely they are to try to get out. It's a natural reaction and inclination. There's also, you know, an expanding oversight accountability, because now we have in 24-25, there's also going to be additional reporting requirements for districts on the use of physical restraint and timeout, and also substantiated or unsubstantiated use of corporal punishment in both our out-of-state, out-of-district, out-of-residence, BOCES, and other programs that may not have already been reporting. Everyone is going to be reporting, and you will be reporting in, including on those CPSE students. Why? Because we saw the disproportionality of the removals of CPSE students and the use of restraint, timeout, and expulsion. So we are adding them, as well as other out-of-district students who are placed in and out of state in residential day or therapeutic programs. So we are going to be continuing to monitor, and that goes right back to our SBA and guidance, that nice, gentle 45-page reminder of, hey, you have obligations for implementation, oversight, and compliance. So this is one of those many ways that we're addressing it. So what is new and changing in terms of regulation, and what does this mean? Again, these are just like the list of the highlights. You know, we changed certain terms. It used to be emergency physical intervention, is now physical restraint. It used to be timeout room, and it's now just timeout, because not every timeout is in a room. Sometimes timeout is a space or a place, but if they're not engaged in instruction and are not participating with their class and, you know, their services, then that may be deemed a timeout. And that also can constitute the possibility of watching for, you know, possible change in program or removal and disciplinary change of placements, which we're going to come up on in a little bit. So just keep mindful that these are some big changes, but it also should be something that, you know, districts have already begun to adapt to, because we, you know, are really looking to eliminate use of physical restraint or behavior intervention as a consequence, as opposed to as a strategy or as a immediate response with the goal of addressing the student's needs programmatically through behavior intervention, through other proactive and other supportive measures, as opposed to reactive and non-restorative practices. And then we already talked about the intervention. Physical restraint is not an intervention, just to be clear. Physical restraint is an emergency. And I know some folks have, you know, talked about, do we put physical restraint, or, you know, that the student may be restrained on those BIPs as part of that? And I know some programs like TCI have that, you know, emergency crisis plan where they, you know, have that. The BIP itself should not be referencing restraint, because it's not an intervention. Restraint is a consequence. It's a reaction. It's a emergency measure. It's not the intervention itself. Behavior intervention plan requires your intervention. What are we doing to change? What are we altering the presets? What are we doing to modify the environment, adapt the expectations, support and reinforce our positive outcomes, and you know, recognize the student for making those changes? But, you know, the physical restraint itself is not an intervention. It is a reaction, and it is a, you know, measure that doesn't always work. So the question everyone asked me was, well, what's really different between the documentation? Anything in red. Anything that's in red on this slide are things that were added or expanded. If you are one of my districts, you've already had all of these provisions with the exception of the debrief on my sample forms. If you are not one of my districts, I'm so sorry. But in those cases, you know, you have a lot of these things that are new that are being added that you need to include. In particular, the list of the positive proactive interventions and strategies you used before timeout or physical restraint, whether they were consistent or implemented by a BIP. If the student has a 504 IEP and they added or other plan, so that could be your multi-level building level intervention support services, because you may have kids who are not yet eligible, but who fall into this parameter, who may eventually be referred. So they may have different plans and supports. And then there's obviously an obligation to assess the student for risk of injury, and whether the student was evaluated by the nurse and other medical professional is an important part, because we're also looking at was the intervention applied in a safe manner, or was the restraint performed in a safe manner. And then finally, the debriefing, which is a new element, which again, administrators will be taking a larger role in monitoring and reinforcing, which is good because the administrators have, also some flexibility on building supports, resources, and strategies. So these are some key definitions and clarifications. The state guidance was a extensive document that included the regulatory changes. It included the background and history. And then after, there was some Q&A type answers where they clarified where it came from, comments and responses to questions that were posed. So here's some of the things that show you what is and is not. Time out is monitored separation of student in a non-locked room, implemented for the purpose of de-escalating, regaining control, and preparing them to come back, i.e. it's an out, relax, regroup, recoup, and back into the program. That's what it's supposed to be. It's not supposed to be an all-day affair. There are some kids who may be in timeout more than once in a day, but again, our goal is not to have them be spending their day in timeout. It's to go in there, regroup, recoup, and get back. Timeout is not a student break or a student, taking a walk, or a student-initiated, strategy. That's not timeout. Use of a room or space containing schools, like sending them to a sensory room, or, having them go do a walk, having them do a quick take 5, having them do some sort of movement activity. That's not time out. That's using a strategy that's part of their IEP or part of their behavior plan. Teacher removal, in-school suspension, or other discipline pursuant to 3214 is not timeout. That would fall under discipline. But it has to be delivered and utilized consistent with 3214, including the notices, the rights, documentation, and other provisions. So that's what is and isn't timeout. We also have a clarification on what is and isn't physical restraint. Physical restraint basically means something that's going to immobilize or limit the movement of a student, arms, legs, head, or body. That's not going to be a physical escort. And that's, I want to make it clear, physical escort, if you are dragging or if there's any forward pressure, then that is not an escort. That is, you're crossing into a restraint or a drag, as the case might be. If you just simply have, your hand on their back as we're sort of turning a corner, or you tap their arm just to direct them into the correct direction, that's different. That's not an escort. You happen to be walking with them. So you are escorting them by proximity, but you are not, physically propelling them towards that location. Brief physical contact or redirection. Again, if the student's upset, having your arm across their back or shoulder is comforting, not, or you are prompting, like hand over hand type guidance, or you're helping them, like modeling. If the student, is trying to get up and you show them how to get to their knees, and then you might help them make sure that their balance is aligned before they attempt to stand up. That is a physical, contact, but that's more, support, hand over hand, or modeling. That is not a restraint. Mechanical restraint is devices that would restrict the movement, but it does not include, devices used by trained personnel. So, your OTs and your PTs, or medical things, like if they have adapted devices that help their body positioning in their chair, or, they're using adaptive equipment that requires you have to put like braces or wrist guards or other things on their hands and arms. That's not a restraint. That's not a mechanical restraint. Using something appropriately is a mechanical restraint, but it is a permitted mechanical restraint. So vehicle safety restraints, when they're used as intended. Restraint for medical immobilization, pelvic or chest harnesses in your wheelchair. If you're sitting in a Rifkin chair, having the support belt to make sure you're in the right position, or, you're secured to certain, positioning devices. Also, it could be, a chair rest at the back of your head to make sure your head's where it needs to be, even if there's like 2 sides to that chair rest, to kind of keep your head upright without moving. And then obviously your orthopedically or prescribed devices they do include a mechanical restraint, but it's a mechanical restraint that is designed to address a medical issue. So your AFOs or your wrist supports or hand straps or using crutches or a gait trainer, those are a form of mechanical support or restraint, but those are permitted. Okay, so what everyone asks me all the time is, well, what can we do? You know, what is permitted and what isn't? And how do you de-escalate if some of these things are not clear? You know, the answer is simple. You can use behavioral management techniques and programming and staffing to address students by teaching them how to communicate, how to control, how to regulate themselves, how to identify if they're upset or if they're frustrated, and, you know, being aware of things that, you know, trigger them or aware of challenges that may trigger others. So that may help you with determining proximity of one student to another, placement within a room, things like that. Evidence-based research strategies that you can use to reduce challenging behaviors. Active listening, number one. Listen to what they're saying, you know, open and accepting body language, you know, reflective. I see that you're upset because you're having a hard time speaking. So let's take a breath and I want to hear you and tell me what you need. You can model, you can give them choices. Do you want to talk here or do you want to step into the hallway so we can have a quiet place to talk? You know, pause and support. Oftentimes, many of our kids get so frustrated that they can't hear you, or, you know, they hear you, but it's not sinking in. So give them time to process. You know, each of these different strategies are just good evidence-based practices for de-escalation, and not a single one of them requires any kind of physical contact for timeout or restraint. Again, most of these are also part of your PBIS, your positive proactive responses and strategies, but this is just to remind you that there's a world of things that are available separate and apart from a BIP, as well as from, you know, a physical intervention or a timeout. These are some more. Voice control, loud, firm comments, not shouting, but, you know, sometimes you need to be clear, you need to be loud, but you also want to keep it succinct. More words equates to more things to pay attention to. Time limited ignoring, you know, you've got brief physical prompts, like tap them, you know, point to their work, you know, you can check them for medical issues. You know, if the student is suddenly acting off, ask them if they need to check their blood sugar, you know, look at whether it's time for their medication. We also have other, you know, different strategies that relate to a prescribed therapy, you know, where we might have certain students need to get, you know, physical feedback. So that might be that they would get, you know, squeezes if that's something that's part of their support and strategy to help them, you know, get a sense of sensory to them. And then obviously your multi-tiered proactive supports and preventive framework, both for the school, the classroom, the program, and then individuals for certain students who may have an FBA or a BIP. So discipline under these new auspices, okay, and I'm going to give it the quickest review possible, but still cover what you need to know. So we have, I like to say there's two kinds of students with disabilities. Those with a disability, i.e. ones we already identified with a 504 or an IEP, and those who might be presumed to be with a disability. Those are ones who have not yet been identified, but who may be eligible for those protections because they've either been referred by the parents or parents have requested referral, but it may not have started. The referral has been initiated in writing and that's already going on, or the evals are in process, where the student is not classified, but they're facing a pattern of discipline that would potentially constitute a change of placement on the basis of discipline. The state calls it DSIP. That makes me think of coffee. Like I want to de-sip that coffee. It seems weird to me. So I always say COP or change of placement. But if it's going to potentially be a change of placement related to a pattern of similar behaviors, similar issues, it might be potential for the student to have presumed student with a disability status. That determination is made by the suspending authority, and depending upon what kind of suspension, it's the principal or the superintendent. And if there's a potential for change of placement, that also means that we need to be notifying our CSE or 504 team, because they may need to be doing the preventive pre-referral and also the expedited evaluations or a manifestation determination. There are a few times where it is not a presumed student, where if the student was referred but the parents didn't consent to eval, or they were found eligible but they didn't get consent for services, or if a student's declassified, they're not presumed, but it doesn't mean that they cannot be re-referred, or it doesn't mean that they couldn't potentially qualify again if circumstances or things have changed. Okay, so what is a change of placement? So removals from programs count towards disciplinary change of placements unless the student receives all their services and continues to participate with their peers. So basically, if you have an in-district alt-ed program where the student leaves their regular classroom, goes to another classroom, and is either continuing to participate in the same curriculum, the same content, and to the same extent with non-disabled peers, then it's basically more of a change of location, not a change of program. That would not necessarily be a disciplinary removal. That's basically being assigned to an alt-ed program. But again, you have to keep in mind, is that consistent with the IEP and how long does that go? But that would not automatically be a change of program. If they go to ISS and there isn't a certified teacher and they're not continuing their instruction and they're just doing their work independently and they're not getting related services and they're not interacting with their peers to the extent they otherwise would have, then those removals count towards the 10-day. And I stress that the 10-day is a finite amount of time, okay? And removals count from a portion or the full day. So sometimes people are like, well, don't worry, I'm only using half days, so I still have more time. No, it's a portion of the day. So if you've had a timeout on a day and if you've done a half day, that counts towards a day of the 10-day removal clock, okay? The second part is that if you get to 10 days, one, you're going to trigger the manifestation determination, but two, every time thereafter, you have to have a manifestation determination before additional discipline can be imposed. And that has not been a new thing, because I stress that I included in here the link to this letter to Perry Zerkel from back in 2021, where they basically answered this question. No, the clock doesn't reset. The whole purpose of manifestation and the 10-day disciplinary change of placement was to ensure that kids with disabilities were accessing their programs. So that has always been the case. As applied, people would restart the clock and count for another 10 days. They might, issue suspension and then ask questions later. They would issue suspension and then do the manifestation. Again, on the first time you get to 10 days, yes, that's what's going to happen. The suspension occurs, then you will get your manifestation determination done. And then depending upon the outcome, you're either going to move forward with additional discipline or changing in programs or BIP and return, whichever of those outcomes apply. And I have those coming up on the next slide. But if after that, the student is suspended again or proposed to be suspended before that suspension is implemented, there needs to be another manifestation determination meeting. Okay, so that is, among some folks, it's been a very big buzz, because they're saying, so wait, if I'm a building administrator, so that means that if a student, turns around and punches another student, I can't suspend until the manifestation determination happens again. And the answer is after the 10th day and a first change of placement, yes. It doesn't mean that you can't try to expedite and hold that manifestation determination promptly. It doesn't mean that the parents and district can't agree to the student not returning pending that. It doesn't mean that you don't have other options, but if the parents and the district are not on the same page on that, no, you can't suspend the student out of school because you need to do the manifestation determination first. And that's why I always say use your discipline very sparingly, because there's only 10, and thereafter you have all of the procedural rights and all of those obligations to not just address the FAPE issue, but also to make sure that you're following manifestation determination, you're providing an IAES, and that the student is continuing to access their program and services, although in a different environment. If there is a proposed change of placement, in addition to the manifestation, you also need to provide the copy of the notice of procedural safeguards. That has to happen at least once a year. If you're one of my clients, my notice of a manifestation determination includes a copy of the notice of procedural safeguards, advises that this is being triggered by a potential change of placement, and covers all of those language. If you don't, you need to look at it, because if you're using your generic forms that may pop out of ClearTrack or Frontline, you may need to revisit that language and talk to your councils or review. And if your parents, you may want to look at it to see, are you getting the information about the change of placement? Because that's what triggers these manifestation determinations, and whether or not there was a determination if it is a change of placement. Presumably, if you're having the manifestation, the answer is yes, it could be, which is why you're having manifestation. And then this is the Q&A. It relates back to the disciplinary Q&A that I referenced from July 2022, but just because this is so far away in the presentation from that guidance doc, I included some of the links directly to those resources. So every time there is a manifestation determination, whenever a student is removed for 10 days or more in a challenge, it's considered a change of placement. They can meet more frequently. You know, there would be nothing that would prevent the manifestation team from, you know, electing to meet after the second disciplinary removal, even if it's only been 2 days, but they must meet whenever there's a change of placement. Sometimes parents want there to be a manifestation after, you know, a short suspension, and the district says we don't need to do that. Again, there's nothing that would prevent you from doing that, but it's up to the district as to whether or not they feel that that's necessary. If they perceive that this may have been a one-off situation, that may not be there. But again, if you can't have the manifestation team meeting, you could still request a program review if you feel that that's something that you need to go back and review and discuss the interventions or supports and services. After a change of placement, but before imposing suspension, there needs to be that manifestation determination review. I do want to stress that our regulations at the 200.1, which is the commissioner's regulations related to discipline, practices, and procedures, has always reflected that the process for coordination of discipline with the superintendent's hearing is that the guilt phase of the superintendent's hearing goes first, meaning the district bears the burden, has to establish the student engaged in this misconduct, and if the student is found guilty of one or more of those factors, they then can be referred over to the manifestation team to review. Because if they're not guilty, there's no need for manifestation. But in the past, because everything, you know, prior to like 2004, pretty much you could drive a truck through everything was a manifestation. They, you know, people sort of got out of the habit of starting with a superintendent's hearing, and they would go right to manifestation. The problem is unless you have parents or students who have admitted to the misconduct, I don't know what you're doing manifestation on if you haven't done the first part of the superintendent's hearing, if it's a case that involves the superintendent's hearing. So who are your members of the manifestation determination team? It's relevant members of the CSE or the 504 team as determined by the district and parents. So usually that's going to be, you know, a chairperson. It will probably be a psychologist or someone with knowledge of behavior. It could be social worker, school counselor, behavioral specialist. If it involves medical or medication related issues, it may involve a school nurse or physician. And then, you know, obviously the parents, in some cases as appropriate, the students, particularly students transition aged on up. And then others that the parent may seek to request be in attendance, or that the district may agree should be in attendance. And that sometimes is your related service providers, your case managers, and other individuals who have knowledge and information. Okay, they have two questions based on what's in the file, in the IEP or the 504 plan, teacher observation, and relevant info from parents. You ask these two questions. Was the behavior that resulted in discipline caused by or directly and substantially related to the student's disability? Or was the behavior a direct result of the district's failure to implement the IEP or 504 plan? I could spend 3 days going over manifestation determination and the ins and outs, but I'm just going to leave you with those questions with the understanding that our goal is always to come to consensus, but if we can't, then the chairperson has to make the final decision and provide written notice explaining what the determination was with respect to the manifestation. And if it is not a manifestation, or it's a manifestation but a 45-day exception, they also need to spell out and explain what the IAES is, which is the interim alternative education setting, which is the program and services the student's going to receive while they're out on whatever discipline may be imposed. Because remember, the CSE and the manifestation team do not issue discipline. We just ensure the programming of the student in order to ensure that they continue to access the FAPE. Typically, if manifestation is found, the discipline ends and the student can return to that program unless parents and district agree otherwise. And again, that may be, we agree that this is a manifestation, but we also agree we need to search for another program, or we want to bring in, you know, and do an FBA VIP, and we need to do other steps and measures. And again, the link to the Q&A and that specific question is right here under the hyperlink. We also need to conduct an FBA VIP or arrange for one if you don't have a functional behavioral assessment or a behavior intervention plan to address that behavior, because if we've got behaviors that are triggering and, you know, result in the need for a manifestation, we have behaviors that are a pattern of removals that we need to figure out how to address. If it's not a manifestation, then the student is subject to the potential for disciplinary removal. And again, that disciplinary removal, going back to our review of discipline in general, is supposed to be appropriate and proportionate to the misconduct. But during that period, the student continues to be entitled to receive a FAPE, a free appropriate public education, though they're in an alternate setting. That means that the manifestation team, and sometimes it's listed as a manifestation team / CSE meeting, has to recommend an IAES, the interim alternative education setting, which affords that student the opportunity to access the instruction, to make progress toward their goals, to participate, although they may be in another setting than their regularly scheduled program. At a minimum, it's got to be the same you'd offer for a non-disabled student. And as we just remember, the state guidance recently issued makes it clear: 2 hours daily elementary, 3 hours daily secondary, or the combination of that over the course of a week. So 10 hours or 15 hours a week, with the exception, especially for a special ed student, that there may be some flexibility where the CSE or manifestation team could determine that the student may need less than the maximum number because of something going on. The student is, in crisis, they're undergoing medication, they're in a half-day outpatient treatment program. There may be some reason that you might modify the day, but again, that should still be subject to regular and ongoing review. And you also, if you have an FBA BIP, you need to review it, because again, nothing is going to change if we don't change our practices and support. So if there's a problem and we're seeing those behaviors arise, the question becomes, are the interventions and strategies we're using effective? Do we need to come up with different things? Do we need to look at collecting different data? Do we need to revisit our program supports and services? The exception to a student being removed if it is a manifestation is what we call the 45-day exceptions. And those are basically where a hearing officer can place a student in an IAES for up to 45 days, where the student has either inflicted serious bodily harm upon someone else at a school event or function. And the definition of what constitutes serious bodily harm is borrowed from the criminal law, which is loss of use of limb or organ, permanent disfigurement, or death. So hopefully we don't have a lot of those things, but it also includes protracted pain. So where I've seen that serious bodily injury, broken bones, fractures, concussions, sad but true. But those are the circumstances that would rise to that level of basic fight, not necessarily, bruising, scratching, marking people. That's not necessarily going to rise to that level. It doesn't mean that they cannot be subject to discipline or consequence, but it is not going to constitute a 45-day exception. Carries or possesses a weapon at school or on school premises. So that's a knife with a blade of more than 2.5 inches, known as the Boy Scout exception, because they used to have to bring their Swiss Army knives as part of their uniform. Also, obviously a gun of any sort or a weapon, but not a threat to carry or possess a weapon. That would not constitute an automatic 45-day exception. It doesn't mean that those threats are not serious, but if they're not actually in possession, that wouldn't necessarily rise to the level of that exception. And then knowingly possesses or uses illegal drugs or sells or solicits controlled substances at school. Again, you may be disabled, but also make some pretty bad decisions. And if it was, if you are a student with a learning disability, I don't think you're working on your math by selling drugs. So that's probably not going to be a manifestation. And you could be subject to a disciplinary removal up to or beyond 45 days. It would be whatever would be imposed on a non-disabled student. But even if they find that it's a manifestation, that the student, maybe we think they didn't understand the consequences, or they didn't realize how much strength they were using, etc., but the injury was still caused and the circumstances were still very unsafe, they can still be removed up to 45 days. There's the discretion on the individual imposing that removal, but they still have to get access to an appropriate alternative education in the interim to make sure they continue to progress towards their goal. Special circumstances, I'm just going to skip through these. I'm not going to cover each one. These are all Q&As about, does discipline protections apply to 3 to 5? Yes. There's a Q&A link that has it. Do they apply if a child violates code of conduct after parent invokes consent for special ed? No. You're no longer a student with a disability or a presumed student with a disability under that circumstance. Do they apply to students with a disability receiving instruction in virtual? Yes. So if you have kids who are on virtual instruction, you need to make sure that they're still getting whatever supports and services they need to address their social, emotional, behavioral needs. And so that may be, having a methodology or a virtual program that allows for intervention, that allows for communication, that allows for other supports, or you may need to provide different supports to ensure that they're still able to get that behavior or social emotional support. And, that may mean looking at how do you adjust your IAES to ensure that the student has that social or communication or behavior support piece. Do the IDEA protections apply to students in private programs? Yep. Do they apply when a student is parentally placed at a private school, not in an LEA where FAPE is not at issue? No. So if a parent unilaterally places their kid in another private school, whether they're pursuing tuition reimbursement or not, if they don't like the discipline that's happening in that program, that's between them and that program, not the public school. Okay, so last are, kind of strategies. What can you do beyond discipline to manage behaviors? And I sort of gave you some wide stroke options of what are permitted, and these are just some additional ones. So really, school-wide programs, your staffing, your training, your special ed programming and resources, constantly making sure that districts are reassessing the needs of their students, collaborative planning with other neighboring districts to maybe say, hey, we'll create the in-district autism program if you create that, working with your BOCES and other private approved programs to look at our upcoming use and needs and really trying to, plan out ahead. Obviously, you can't plan a crisis because crises happen, but there are certain things where we know we have a number of kids who are out in these private approved, but if we could bring them into a local BOCES program, that would limit the travel time. It would also give them, a closer LRE. Those may be things that you're looking at trying to develop internally. And then whatever you do, whether it's behavior support or a behavior intervention plan or building level supports and services, if you've got a plan, if you've got a strategy, you got to do data collection and documentation and then review it. The best data means what if you're not reviewing it and analyzing it and using it to inform your decisions. And that really is where, progress monitoring and regular and ongoing review of data is just the message that everyone needs to get. And, we really have become good at collecting data. I still think we have some movement to go on being able to use, analyze, and then internalize how that data can inform instructional practices and programs. I like to mantra is behavior doesn't change on its own. It's going to take time to get them annoyed. It's going to take time to bring them back down. So, really thinking about, if you're in the red zone with a child and they're in the red zone, no one should be talking to each other because it's not going to go well. You cannot negotiate with toddlers, teenagers, and terrorists. Nobody wins, okay? But what you can do is say, maybe I need to tag out, maybe somebody else needs to step in. If I am sitting here and we're in the yes, no, we're already losing. You cannot positional bargain. You need to figure out how to get to choices, how to get to, forced options, how to come about with a different approach, because if what you're doing isn't working, doing the same thing louder or longer isn't going to work either. So really thinking about different ways to look at behavior. And then when they do, even if it's been a 25-minute, argument, when they finally do the behavior you need to throw a freaking parade, because we are now going to recognize you got there, you did it. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. And the hope would be that seeing that positive response will encourage them to do it again in the future and, start learning that you can get the same outcome, support, or desired behavior through positive interventions instead of waiting for negative attention. You could get positive attention, and that's so much nicer and easier. And last but certainly not least, if you have students who are, having behaviors interfering with the learning of others, we have both our special ed supports, our FBA VIP, and you can also have building level supports, interventions, and strategies. I mean, again, some students with 504 plans also will have building level supports, MTSS, multi-tier support system, or PBIS, positive behavior intervention systems. You may have school level rewards, you may have building level, you may have grade level rewards or reinforcements, or, if this class gets X number of points, they can have a pizza party. Those are all part of different ways to motivate and encourage engagement for students. And then we also have to, look at if they are in those classrooms and those things don't seem to be working, you may need to individualize And that includes at private approved programs and BOCES. You know, many of them have their own built-in structure of support, but if the student is not responding, then we may need to individualize that to make sure that we're addressing their needs, because maybe they need that plan, but they might need more frequent reinforcement. They may need more regular recognition, or more hands-on, or more modeling, or more intervention of some sort or other. And then again, if you've documented the use of appropriate strategies, modification, adaptation, staffing support, FBA, BIP, then at that point, if you need to talk about more restrictive programs and services, you have the data you need to be able to have that discussion, particularly where it relates to behavior. And that can be a tough discussion, because oftentimes, as we know, the programs are limited, and that means we may have kids who are going further away from home. And, you know, that can be difficult for families. We certainly know that transportation can be long and arduous, and that is never a fun thing, but we are still trying to, you know, make do with what we've got. A couple of other last minute things. Medication is not a requirement. Schools can't condition supports or services, but there is nothing that would prevent schools from having a conversation with parents about, you know, according to this, last time the student was medicated, you know, they seem to be responding. Now they don't have medication, and we've noticed this uptick in behaviors. You know, we encourage you to share that with your provider. We're not saying medicate, we're not saying don't, we're just observing and providing relevant information that may help them. On the flip side, if you know that the parent is very anti-medication, then, you know, that discussion may not go well, but we can certainly review and discuss our FBA and BIP and how we're attempting to address those behaviors. But when you have some students where it's literally, you know, their cognitive ability is lower, so it's not a matter of being able to counsel them to be able to recognize and to alter that pattern, but if it's an internal anxiety, it's really difficult to get them past that, because we can provide all the external reassurances, but they may not be able to move past that point. And I think it's really just helping the parents understand that, you know, we're not saying what you need to do, but you need to review this and continue to discuss with your providers, because there may need to be some alternative approaches. And, you know, unfortunately, there's not the ability for every student to respond to counseling or, you know, different kinds of therapeutic interventions. So sometimes medication is the option, but again, we will work with kids however they come. But if their needs cannot be regulated with those appropriate supports and services, we may end up looking at more restrictive options. Behavior approaches have to adapt. You know, again, it's not going to happen overnight, so you need to keep working. And if it's not working, change it, because doing the same thing and expecting a different result, definition of insanity. And I also reiterate that discussion about a change of placement is a CSE discussion. Okay, sometimes we have administrators that will say, I want this kid out. You know, that it's nice to wish, but decisions about placement for students are made by the CSE. There are disciplinary provisions that are within your purview, but our, you know, ability to move or look more restrictive has to do with our fulfilling the obligations under the IEP and ensuring that we have, you know, complied with the regulations and the due process. And I think that we're going to have a lot more of those, you know, harder discussions in the next year or two, because this is, you know, again, it's not new, but there are some people who are hearing for the first time that, you know, once you get to 10 days and thereafter, every potential suspension is a change of placement, which requires manifestation prior to implementation, you'll have more, you know, pushback and feedback. And there's also going to be staff members saying, why is this unsafe child still in my school? They hit this person, they broke that, you know, why are they still here? How come they can't be removed? This is ridiculous. And we will have to manage and navigate those conversations. And one of the best ways to do it is educating, you know, educating parents, educating the community, and educating your staff. You know, if they understand that this is not, you know, we're not trying not to support or assist them, but this is regulatory and we don't have these options. This is what the requirements are. It may help. Final thought is that physical restraint and seclusion are not effective strategies to modify student behavior. There is no evidence-based support anywhere ever that shows that this is going to resolve or address the behavior. It should always and only be your last resort. They should never be used as, you know, punishment or discipline. It should be part of a BIP if you're using time out, and it should be part of a larger strategic plan to address those behavior. But what we know does work are de-escalation, behavioral support, restorative practices, leadership and messaging, focusing on keeping kids in school and focus on learning, and really staff development and training. You know, we need to shift our mindset from reactive and to restorative and responsive, and consider the motivation and the roots of issues. And that's really where we're going to get to where we want to go. All right, so I am now going to close down my presentation. Are you guys still seeing it, or did the share end?
The share's done.
Okay, so I don't know. I'm going to look and see if there's questions in the Q&A, which there may be, and I don't see any. So do you have any questions that came up, Alyssa?
We had a couple related to the tutoring and suspension kind of connections there.
Okay.
So for one, someone asked if a student with a presumed disability is suspended, would they still be entitled to this tutoring and services out of school? And does the removal time include time that they're held in the office out of class?
Okay, so if a student with a presumed disability is suspended out of school, they're presumed for protections from disability, and you have to do a manifestation, but that doesn't mean that you will complete the eligibility determination process. So they would be protected and get manifestation, but unless you have made the full eligibility and completed evaluations, you may, you know, not have the same levels of support. It's weird because there's a guidance, an OSEP guidance that came out, I want to say 3 or 4 years ago, that talked about what happens with a manifestation if the student is referred, but the evaluations haven't been completed at the time you're trying to do manifestation. Won't that negate manifestation because you don't have the information? And the guidance was, well, the district can do whatever it can within the 10 days, you know, assuming that you're on day 1 of discipline, that you need to, you know, convene and hold a manifestation determination, but no, you may not defer or delay a determination of manifestation. You must conduct that. And if you cannot complete, you review what information you have. You're automatically going to be no on was the failure to implement the IEP a manifestation because they didn't have one. But the question is, was the underlying disability, you know, the directly caused the conduct that resulted in discipline removal? It's either going to be yes or no. If the answer is yes, then, you know, you're going to expedite and finish the evaluation process, but an expedited evaluation truncates the timeline from 60 days down to approximately 20. You have to complete the evaluations within 15. You have to meet and hold an eligibility determination within 5, but it's still, you know, it's still longer than you want, and you may end up having some, you know, lag time. But again, the question then becomes, once they are deemed eligible, should there be a review or discussion about possibility of comp ed? Those would be case-by-case basis issues that I would look at.
Thank you. So we've hit noon, so I think that's all the questions we're going to have time for today, but we'll definitely.
I did have one, I see one question, if that's okay. What do you do if packages were sent out, referrals, and no one's accepting the student? The answer is notify the state, because we're supposed to be notifying the state if we are unable to find a program or services and we've massive, you know, referral. And be careful about, you know, making more restrictive placements if we can't find an appropriate therapeutic or day program. That's when you may want to use hard to place, hard to serve referrals, because we are still subject to our LRE mandate, and a lot of that is tied into having those other community-based supports. But there's a notice requirement in the law that people are not aware of, that you should be aware of, that should require a letter to the state if we do not have the ability, notwithstanding the research and search, to find a program. All right, that was it.
No, and that's a really important point to end on. So we'll take a look at those, you know, for future topics and things. We want to remind everyone that you will be getting linked to an evaluation of today's program, and it's really helpful to us if you complete those. And then we've been having some slight technical glitches this morning, but the PowerPoint presentation will be sent out to all attendees as well. So thank you everyone for joining us this morning, and thank you, Tara, for such an informative presentation, and we hope everyone has a great afternoon.
Thank you all.